We are back with a brand new setting. If you're listening on Spotify, on podcast, you don't get to see the wonderful background. But I think it's quite a cool atmosphere to do a couple of episodes in the gym. Really, for me, where it all happens, all of the training, all of the hours that go down is all inside of here. So what I thought was, a few bits of content I've done have looked really, really cool lately. So I thought, why not shoot a few episodes in here because the lighting's great, hopefully, and we can just chat all things today, how to avoid injuries when training. And I think that this topic is so important to cover because as we get closer to Hyrox events, and this episode today doesn't just appeal to people who are just doing Hyrox. Like, this is everybody that is involved in some level of sport, commitment to training, and really showing up to training regularly. And I think that injury can be everything from a small, minute niggle to, quite a catastrophic situation that requires a lot of time off, a lot of healing, a lot of money spent on rehab, potentially even operation. So, we really want to kind of look after our body as well as we do put our body through the training that we do as well. So I want to bring you an episode today. Before we get into it, as always, if you are enjoying my content, my education that I'm putting across and out there and educating people to different levels really of, performance, health optimization, everything. I'm trying to kind of cover the whole spectrum of, basically human performance, not just athletic performance. So if you like it, if you're enjoying it, please, as always, hit subscribe, hit that button, and be sure to subscribe because, again, it all helps in building the audience, essentially, to put more and more of this stuff out there. So let's get deep into this. Let's dive into how we can prevent injury. Now, I do believe that the majority, not always all, but the majority of injuries, overuse injuries, imbalances can be avoided. I really, truly do believe that. Now, there are the odd situation, for example, where you might get an acute injury that happens through impact, right? And those things they're not avoidable, okay? But for the vast majority of injuries that come from overuse, imbalances, not deloading regularly, can be avoided. So I kind of put together in my mind quite a lot actually, not even a few, quite a few reasons as to why we get injured, and also how we can then make these adjustments to our lifestyle, our training, our approach to what we're doing so that we can prevent things happening, okay? Prevent injuries happening. So let's talk about Hyrox as a sport. When we look at Hyrox as a sport, most of the design of Hyrox as a layout format workout is working inside of our sagittal plane. Okay, so for example, your lunges, running, squatting, rowing, skiing, everything is in one plane of motion or one plane of movement, and that is our sagittal plane. When we look at it at different planes of motion, we have like transverse plane, we have rotational plane, and with it being, let's say, don't quote me on percentage, but let's say that 75% of Hyrox or 80% of Hyrox is movements inside of our sagittal plane. It's a great thing, but it can also sometimes create a lot of problems when it comes to imbalances, because we will rely on certain muscle groups that are overactive. We will neglect muscle groups that are underactive. We will create a situation over time when we're constantly training these Hyrox movements and we're running more, where if we don't look at our imbalances first and we start to progress our training, then we can get a lot of imbalance injuries. Okay, so if we were working a sport that had a multitude of planes and it was all kind of like spread out evenly. So some exercises that, you know, working in the sagittal plane, some that are working in transverse, some are rotational. Then we're having to kind of like work all different planes of motion. But with a lot of Hyrox being designed in the sagittal plane, then it's up to us as coaches, and it's our responsibility, but it's also up to us as athletes, if we don't have a coach helping us, that if we want to remain injury free, then we also have to make sure that inside of our training process, or if we're a coach, inside of our programming process, we are including rotational movements, we're including transverse movements, etc., etc. Okay, so let's say, for example, somebody is more dominant on their left glute, is working harder than their right glute. Okay, let's say that let's take myself, for example, actually. Okay, so I used to be a footballer. I'm left-footed, so I'm a lefty. I'm dominant on my left foot. So a lot of my planting was on my right foot. So my glute and my hip on my right-hand side is a lot more dominant, but then my left quad is more dominant through multiple extension kicking the ball over years and years and years. So what I've had to do is work a lot on balancing that out. So a lot more quad work on my right hand side, a lot more glute work on my left hand side, so I can create a balance. Because when I started to increase my running when I was in my early 20s and my running volume, but I wasn't playing football anymore, the consistent running pattern really highlighted those imbalances. So that's my advice to you as kind of point one of avoiding injuries when training for Hyrox is, one, understanding that we're working a lot of one plane of motion, especially if we're doing Hyrox classes as well. There's lots of affiliate gyms that, you know, I believe it's their responsibility to be designing, transverse, rotational, core strength work that supports the training process for Hyrox, and not just throwing all of their gym members into multiple Hyrox classes that look fun but are full of sagittal work, basically overloading that sagittal plane. So if you are an athlete listening in right now and you're looking to remain injury free, definitely think about adding in some transverse work, some unilateral work, some rotational work, some core strength. And I do believe that should be really put into your training immediately if you're not doing it, so that you can continue to progress inside of Hyrox. Okay. The second part we need to think about in how we can avoid injuries, especially when training for Hyrox, is something that has come up quite a lot in conversation, but I haven't seen a lot out about, there's not a lot of discussion around it. And that is that if I think about the 20 plus races I've done, there's only been maybe 2 or like 5% of those races, or 10%, where I'm actually racing in a, let me get this right, a clockwise direction. I raced in Dubai, I believe we were racing clockwise, but most of my events have been anti-clockwise. So you're running 8 kilometers, you're doing 4 corners every lap, potentially doing 3 laps in 1 kilometer. So that's 3 times 8. Come on, you mathematicians out there, help me out. 8, 16, 24. It's potentially 24 laps. Okay, 24 laps. I don't know what this is, but 24 times 4. That's how many times you're turning on that one side. Okay, every time you're turning that corner, you're running, okay? Now, the good thing about Hyrox, I know most people moan about Hyrox being jam-packed and you're having to dodge and weave in and out of other athletes, but actually the dodging and the agility required for that is quite actually good for conditioning. But going back to what I was saying, a lot of Hyrox running is kind of like one directional. So if we actually look at some athletes that are training, I do one session a week on the track as well. Usually we're running anti-clockwise on the track as well. So if you're doing, a cheeky little session of 10 by 400s, that's a lot of turning. You're consistently turning. And what I've noticed when I've done a lot of track work without strength is one side tends to shorten. And I think over time, that's potentially what we're going to see with athletes is, their left, if they're doing a lot of anti-clockwise races and track work, they're going to find that, the left side is going to start to shorten and the right side might elongate, and they might start getting injuries either on that left-hand side, Achilles, up the posterior chain, in the ankle mobility, stability, more so than the right hand side. But again, this is just things to think about as a Hyrox athlete and be aware of, because later down the line, through consistent exposure to these things, can create imbalances and injuries. I would say that the next thing to think about, okay, if you are a Hyrox athlete looking to avoid injury, is to really think about your recovery tactics, okay? So we're putting ourselves out there, we're doing a lot of heavy training, probably more training than we've ever done before. There's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves to develop as a Hyrox athlete, because, you know, the Hyrox sport has grown so fast and we want to be growing with it, that, you know, we can jam pack our training into sort of like a very intense like approach. And therefore, we have to also pay attention to our recovery methods, okay? So am I regularly utilizing hot-cold therapy, right? Am I regularly helping the body get rid of lactate? Am I regularly bringing my central nervous system back down, right? Like after training, are you spending time taking your body through an element of like box breathing or, you know, calming mechanisms that are going to allow the central nervous system to just decompress after that training session? One piece of advice I always give my clients I work with is don't go straight from the gym into your day. Like commit to 5 minutes or 10 minutes of just bringing your body back down to its parasympathetic state so that it can go about its day in a much more calm approach, and therefore your stressors aren't high, your body's not in this fight or flight state from your training. So recovery tactics is really key. And I won't go into all of the recovery tactics because I could do a whole episode on that. But a few that I like to, you know, commit to is, at the moment, I'm actually trying out a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, which is great, but you don't have to go that advanced, okay? I think when we're competing at such a high level, we're trying to look for that 10% extra in our performance. We do try things like that. But I would say for like basic recovery strategies, eating low inflammation foods, staying really well hydrated, adjusting your training if you haven't slept. Okay, if you haven't slept and you're frustrated because you haven't slept, it doesn't mean go and, you know, wreck yourself in the gym even harder and beat yourself up. It actually could mean that you cut, you know, the next 48 hours, you cut your training down by, you know, 50% because you haven't recovered as well. Monitoring your timing of your nutrition. Are you eating regularly? Are you eating enough to support your training? Are you going for regular walks in nature? Okay, and staying in tune with that. Are you, like I said, utilizing sauna, cold therapy, okay? Having a cold dip a few times a week is great. It's great. It's great for your body. It's great for vasodilation. You're maximizing the body's recovery. And it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't have to invest in a couple of £1,000 tank at home. Even just waking up in the morning and giving yourself a cold shower is enough sometimes to just take your breath away and trigger that response of recovery in the body as well, boosting your testosterone levels, boosting that growth hormone, and helping flush out all of the lactate from your heavy training week. So recovery tactics to support your training, that's going to be absolutely key. What's the next thing? So avoiding injuries, I would also say, try not to do too much intensity. Like, how much is too much intensity? That's probably what the question you're asking. And if you actually go back onto all of my episodes, all of my podcast episodes on Spotify, you'll find a whole episode talking about intensity and how much is too much intensity. But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if you are training at an intensity that means that you can only train 2 or 3 times per week without feeling fatigued and burnt out, it's usually not the right dose. And a lot of people training for Hyrox are, in my opinion, doing too much intensity and not enough aerobic volume work, not enough weight training, not enough zone 2 and 3 development work that's going to build the mitochondria, that's going to help with glycosis. All of those things, like, we don't always need to be doing high intensity training. I would say that high intensity training, you probably only really want to be hitting twice a week. Okay, so really think about that. Good quality high intensity, you don't need to be doing all of the time. Okay, otherwise, in my opinion, it's not quality high intensity work. Okay, so getting your dosage of the stimulus of training is super, super, super important to avoid injury. The other thing with high intensity training is if we do too much of it, we're not recovering enough because it takes longer to recover from high intensity training, takes a lot more out of the body, and therefore your nervous system is quite irregular. So it's quite, let's say, inside of that kind of fight or flight response, the system is quite out of balance. That could lead to hormone dysfunction in females if they're doing too much high intensity, for example, and we need to make sure that we're regulating that. Okay, so CNS overload is something we really, really, really want to avoid as athletes, as everyday athletes, as people who are looking to perform. The next thing I would say that, I see a lot of injuries happen because of is because the athlete doesn't have a progressive, periodized program. And that could be you listening right now, okay? Progressive overload and periodization are two things that are absolutely vital if we're not only looking to actually progress our fitness, but if we are actually looking to avoid burnout and injury. Okay, because what we need to be doing is we need to be applying the right dose to make an adaptation in the body, to allow enough recovery before that next session to continue to progress. What we tend to see is an athlete will, that's quite underinformed, will throw everything at the wall, hope it sticks, do a bit of weight training because we fancy it here, I might jump in a Hyrox class here, I'm gonna do a track session with friends on a Saturday, but there's no real periodization from week to week. Okay, and that's where like a coach can come in and help, right? They are, some are qualified to actually put a progressive program in place so that you are avoiding injury, avoiding overload. So we want progressive overload, but we don't want to tip the balance into overloading the body. And then obviously correct dose of stimulus. Okay, so for example, what are we working on, right? That's the question we need to ask. You cannot progress everything all at once. So when you're looking to develop and progress in Hyrox, we need to think about, okay, what is the first thing I need to develop right now? What is the area of my Hyrox that is the lowest hanging fruit that is holding me back right now? And how do I now develop that area whilst also maintaining other areas, but not trying to progress those as well? Because what we'll find is if we're trying to progress it all at once, again, we run the risk of injury, we run the risk of burnout, we run the risk of our nervous system just completely being shot to pieces. And then it's not making adaptation. And if anything, we could then run the risk of regression as well. So our fitness and our conditioning actually starts going backwards. And then we're saying to our coach, or we're saying to our friends in the gym, why aren't I hitting race PBs? Why do my legs just feel heavy every session? Like why every week do I go and do that training session? It just doesn't feel easier, right? Or, I'm not hitting, my paces aren't improving. These are all bottlenecks for Hyrox athletes. And if you don't have a process, you're always going to run into those walls, okay? And then my last but not least on my list of things that can prevent injury is making sure you have enough time between your races. So many people will end up injured inside of the Hyrox season because they are not allowing themselves to decompress after a race. So for example, you have a race. Okay, you've trained really hard for that race. You now take a week off. Well, not a week off, but you take it easy for a week. The taper week, the goal is to just maintain fitness. We're not trying to make adaptations. We're not trying to push any harder. We're trying to maintain. Then we have our event, and then after our event, we have a deload period. Or we should. Okay, maybe 5 to 7 days where we just decompress the body after a heavy lead up to the race and the race. So we have 2 weeks there where the body is just kind of in maintenance mode. You've had the competition in the middle, you've maintained before, you're kind of maintaining after, recovering the body well before you hit the next training cycle. Now, if you want to make progress between your first race and the next one, you need more than 2 weeks. I'm telling you for a fact, because once you've taken your deload week, If you then have a race a week later, you're having to taper again, then deload again. You've had 2 races, but you've also stagnated potentially your performance over a whole month. You've had a month of no progress really because you haven't been able to train because you've been tapering and recovering. So my advice after an event is to give yourself enough time to recover, give yourself enough time for the body to start peaking again and potentially making new adaptations so that you can progress towards the next event. Now that might take 4 weeks, it might take 6. That depends on the individual's background, how long they've been racing, how used to their body is to event stimulus. But truly, honestly, we do need a good amount of time. It's called what we call stress adaptation. And if we don't allow enough time between our races, what we might find in the second half of the season is our performance starts to drop because the whole season has been spent tapering and recovering and then racing again. And we know that racing takes it out of our body. The lead up to the competition, the mental exhaustion, the physical exhaustion, the emotional stress leading up to that race, decompression is massive. And it's a huge requirement for you to be able to become the best athlete you can and maximize your ability. Okay, so those really are some of my real top tips around avoiding injury as an athlete. I would say that one thing I've maybe forgotten to mention is the dosage of running. So I see a lot of Hyrox athletes who maybe don't have a running background. Maybe you've done a lot of bodybuilding or you've come from a CrossFit background, for example, and you're now in this space where you've got an 8K event to run. Okay, you potentially 9K with the Rock Zone. So you're now like, okay, I hardly do any running. I lift weights. I don't really enjoy running, so I'm gonna have to fall in love with this process because running 8K per week is not gonna be enough, truly. Running a 5K every week is just not gonna be enough for Hyrox development. So, what is my advice when starting to develop your running? What we have to understand is it takes time, okay? Your body takes time to progress in running. It's not just something that happens overnight. The body needs to adapt to the mechanics of running. It's not just as simple as putting your trainers on and going out there. And it's also not just as simple as, doing a few more 10Ks, a couple more 15Ks and a long run on a weekend. We need to think about the dosage of running. Now, I'm in my pre-season phase as I record this right now, and I'm about 6 weeks out from my first major event ever, which is exciting for the Elite 15. And I'm approaching this season with in mind that my running is one of my powers. My running is one of my strongest points of Hyrox. So right now, I'm actually running in excess of 60K a week, which for somebody coming into Hyrox for the first time without a running background might be severely daunting. Like, I'm out. If that's what I've got to run, no thank you. And you do not have to run that kind of mileage every week to be ready for Hyrox, okay? And it's taken me, I've never always been a runner. I used to play football, so I had a good aerobic capacity. And then I got into Spartan racing. So, I used to do a lot of trail running, but I've never been a natural runner. I used to be a sprinter. So it's something I've had to really, really, really work on. Now, my advice for remaining injury-free when progressing your running is do not increase your mileage by more than 10% per week as you develop. Okay, so as you develop your running every single week, don't make a jump of 40% extra the week after, because your body needs time, your ligaments, your tendons in your ankles, your knees, your hips, all of those, because running has quite a strong impact on the body. So you need to basically just build and build and build slowly, allow the body to get used to the mechanics of running. I would always advise having a gait analysis done 100% so that you're not heel striking too much, you're not overloading the hamstrings, you're really utilizing the efficiency of being able to run well as well, because that will always have foundations for being able to progress your running a lot better. So yes, I would say that another injury risk with Hyrox is developing your running too fast. So your mechanics can't keep up. You're not adapting the ligaments and tendons. You're not allowing that time for them to adjust and adapt and get stronger. And therefore you can end up with injuries. And we see a lot of calf injuries, hamstrings, hamstring tendonitis, tendinopathy, sorry, you see a lot of tendonitis problems, a lot of Achilles, a lot of kind of like lack of ankle mobility as well. So these are things that really pay attention to when you're starting to progress with your running. Okay, so no more than 10% per week in terms of mileage. Those are my top tips for staying injury-free when progressing towards either your first Hyrox race, or if you now have Hyrox experience and you're looking to progress. And to be honest, any of these tips can, apply and kind of ripple out to any sport really that, requires, I would say anybody that's doing too much intensity could run the risk of central nervous system burnout. Anybody who's progressing their running more than 10% per week when increasing it could run into problems. I would say anybody that's just training in the sagittal plane could have imbalances eventually. So, this can apply to any given sport out there that, really kind of feel, if you are an athlete in those sports that feels that this is quite relatable. So as ever, if you are enjoying, if you love this episode, feel free to share it with friends. Let's get this education stuff out there. Let's get the depth of this work out to Hyrox athletes in the masses, because there's not many people that are talking about this. And so it's so important to try and get this across so that we can keep as many people in the sport of Hyrox as possible without injuries, without having to sell their tickets, without being gutted because they've trained and then they've had to pull out at the last minute. We want to keep athletes as healthy as possible, as always. Okay, so hit the subscribe. Please like the video if you enjoyed this episode, or if you're not watching this on YouTube and you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, please feel free to hit the like, hit the love button, hit the love heart, and yeah, make sure you subscribe so we can keep this flowing. Other than that, much love to you all. Happy training, healthy training. That's me out for now. Take care. Bye-bye.